Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Shayna Cersei and I'm so excited to paint with you today. So today we're going to be continuing a series of paintings that I will be doing from inspiration from my recent trip to the UK. So I spent time in London, Manchester, as well as in the Lake District in the town of Windermere and Bowness-on-Windermere. So today I'm going to be doing a landscape painting. I'm going to put the picture up right here, the inspirational picture. This was just a little meadow scene with some trees in it that I took on my way. I walked between Windermere and Bowness-on-Windermere. So I walked between two cities up in the Lake District, or two towns, and this was one of the photos on my way journey for that walk. So highly recommend the Lake District in the UK. It was really inspirational. Later on, we'll get to some architectural paintings of my time in London and Manchester, and some city life paintings there. But we're going to concentrate on some of the beautiful landscapes of the Lake District, and we're going to get started right now.
All right, we are ready to go. I have 100% cotton paper, which I highly recommend if you can get it for landscapes, especially those that require lots of water. I have it adhered down to my board, or my table actually in this case, and I'm going to be using my palette of Core paints. These are Core by Golden, and I have my silver black velvet brush. Any larger size brush, size 10 or 12 round brush will do. And I have both clean and a dirty water cup today because I'm going to be adding lots of clean water for wet on wet techniques. So the first thing we're going to do, and let me put this inspirational picture up here again in the corner. The first thing we're going to do is our sky. And we're going to concentrate on creating those clouds. We are going to imagine a horizon line in here. You can draw one in if you'd like, but I'm just going to start wetting the paper all the way halfway down the page. So I'm just going to kind of create an imaginary horizon line there for myself, and then wet my paper very generously. And I'll just show you kind of where we're going on this first step. I have a sample that's kind of halfway through. So we're going to be doing the sky with these very soft clouds with lots of white areas in between, some light peeking through, and then we'll be doing a couple of different washes and texture on the bottom to get us started before we really start concentrating on the details of the tree, the background, and the little trees on the side. I'm sorry, the distant tree line and the trees on the side. So we're setting up our sky first. And if you're using 100% cotton paper, it's probably quite thirsty. Thirsty meaning it absorbs the water very nicely. So you might have to add more than you think. But then as you add it, you don't want any puddles anywhere. So you're just going to be using your brush to really smooth that out. And then I like to wait a few seconds, like 30 seconds or so, for some of that water to absorb, and then add a little bit more. Because you want it nice and damp for this process. Okay, so you do want it shiny, just no standing puddles. And you'll start to see the paper will soften a bit in those areas compared to the parts that are still dry. It'll start to expand a little bit with the water. All right, I think we're ready to go. So I'm going to take a little Payne's Gray here in my palette, as you can see, and I'm going to water it down a lot. So our first color is Payne's Gray, and I want a really light Payne's Gray. So even though this is very light, we're still adding it to water. It's going to lighten up even more. And now our clouds are kind of receding towards the background. They're coming, this was taken with a slightly wider angle lens, and they're coming really wide this way, and they're receding almost in a V shape towards the background. So I'm going to try to emulate that with how I paint these. So I'm just going to start dropping in and leaving white space between. And I want the white space between the clouds to be bigger than it will actually be at the end. And then I'm just going to get smaller and smaller as I go down. So big clouds and then smaller with smaller spaces in between as we go towards the background. I'm actually going to darken this up just a little bit. Right here in the center, I have a little puddling from just some of the extra water that I added when I added the Payne's Gray. I'm actually just going to lift that off before I continue, because that'll create a problem later on as this continues to dry. So I just lifted that off. Now I'm going to continue to add. These clouds. I like to really get my corners up here. And we will do another layer on this, okay? While this will be real-time painting video, it will not be real-time drying video. So we are going to have to dry between layers. And then this, I'm going to just mess this up a little bit. And just looking at it, you don't want anything too symmetrical. I'm actually going to take this. I'm going to get a really big kind of swath in this corner to kind of force this perspective a little bit. And another one that's going to be a little bit darker right here in the center. And throw some smaller, ooh, that was a little too dark. It's okay if that happens, you get too dark. When you're so wet on wet, you can just pull those off. Everything's so damp still. You don't have to worry about it too much. All right, and now I'm going to let this dry. It is going to lighten considerably. It may already look pretty light. I do like the drama that it's creating. It does look, I think we'll be okay. It does look like when this was popped up, it was creating a little bit of a line here. It looked very light, but actually it's just because the paper's popped up a little there. So that shadow does continue across. And you're going to want to continue to play with this just as I am. You just have to remind yourself to stop. Stop, please. You are going to get a chance to go back and do another layer on this. A second layer for more drama, a little bit more color. We're going to add a little blue tint to the next layer. All right, so I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop and let it dry. And the wet on wet, this is going to continue to dry and move and change a little bit as it dries. So let's let that dry, and we're going to start to work on the ground while that dries. And then once our first layer of our ground is in, we're going to have to pause and let the whole thing dry. I'll do a little camera magic and we'll cut right to the post-drying period. But just to keep that in mind, there will be some drying time. So let's pick up we're going to pick up some cadmium yellow. And I'm going to make this nice and light, add a lot of water. And then I'm going to pick up a little bit of magenta to get this very light orangey color. And then the tiniest bit of, I'm going to pick up ultramarine. You could also pick up a cobalt blue. And that's just going to tan this out a little bit. It's going to desaturate it a little bit. A little bit more magenta. I'm going for a more tan kind of wheat color. There we go. You can see I have like this tannish color. This is just going to be our bottom layer. It's going to be our lightest color on the foreground. We're going to put a lot of green over top of it. So right now I'm just going to paint this in horizontal lines, wet paint on dry paper, so wet on dry. And you can see I'm allowing a lot of texture. I'm not adding a lot of extra water, but I am adding some. I want different areas to be darker and lighter. I don't want this to be a flat wash. But I do want to fill in the majority of the area. If you are leaving any white spots, keep them minimal. I'll probably fill most of mine in, but there will definitely be a little more of this. I used all of that paint. Again, this paper is super thirsty, also meaning it absorbs paint really quickly too, or quite a bit. And I just made a little bit more, a little orangier tan, and I'm just adding in some different areas to create different shadow, darker areas and lighter areas. And then I'm going to leave that. I really do this part intuitively, you know, looking at your reference photo, but I'm really using that photo just as inspiration, but not for like the main parts, but I'm not trying to recreate it step by step every area, but I am trying to recreate the mood of the whole piece. So you can see we have lighter areas, darker areas, and that's just the tan base layer. It's kind of the dirt underneath all of the grass. All right, so we are gonna start to make our green because we can work on this when it's still a little wet. So I'm gonna take sap green here, and I'm gonna add a little cadmium yellow to it just to brighten it up a little bit for our first layer. Okay, and then in this, I'm going to start doing the same thing, adding a green layer on top, letting a little bit of that tan layer poke through in some areas. And you can see my sky is a little damp still, and I let the green touch that and the tan. I'm okay with it. It's not going very far, and I know I'm going to put a dark tree line in the background that's going to cover that up later, but you can be more careful than I was for that layer for sure. All right, we're going to let this all dry, and then we're going to work on layer 2. All right, we are back, and I have a nice dry piece. It's not bone dry, but it's very, very dry to the touch. But I can see it has a little more drying to do in terms of flattening out, but that's okay. We're gonna get started on, first I'm gonna do texture on the grass. Or actually no, I'm gonna do one more layer on the sky because we want that to dry while we're doing the texture on the grass so we can put our tree in. So let's start with the sky again. So you can see it's dried very nicely. I have all of these nice little light spots, but I wanna deepen the shade a little bit, the value of some of the clouds, and I wanna add a little bit of a tint of blue to it. So I'm going to wet it again. I am gonna be a little less generous this time with letting the water soak in and really, really wetting the paper. So I'm just gonna gently make a nice damp surface, and I'm not gonna be adding as much paint this time. I want to just add to a few areas. Perfect. So with my Payne's Gray, I'm gonna take the same Payne's Gray. Now you can choose if you wanna add a little bit more, want this to be a little more blue or a little more purpley in nature. If you want it to be more purpley in nature, you can add a little magenta as well as a blue. So I'm just adding a little ultramarine. I like ultramarine because it actually is a granulating color and it separates a bit on the page, and I think that can look really interesting. All right, so you still want a light version of this color, lots of water. But we're going to just start adding it to the base of some of the clouds that are already there. Making sure not to get too uniform. So this one up here, definitely. and you're not doing it, and you are going to get some of these little bursts, the little starbursts when you pick up your brush. If they're really bothering you, or you feel like they're not going to blend out as it dries, you can go back through after it's dried for a few minutes, not even minutes, but by the time you're kind of done adding all of your color in, what you do is you just rinse off your brush. You want a nice clean brush, but you're also going to dab it off quite a bit. So it's just damp, but there's no water coming off of it. You don't want to introduce any new water, and you just kind of rub the edges very slightly with the tip of the brush. You don't have to paint over the whole thing. Just kind of rub out those edges just a bit here and there. Just to, if you want to just kind of soften those edges. I'm going to add a little bit more that darker blue as we get further away. Just giving the impression the clouds are kind of getting a little closer and smaller as we recede into the distance. Bring this one over a little bit there. You know, I'm going to join these up in the corner. I don't like this kind of uniform gap they were getting there. There we go. Yeah, I like that better. All right, we're going to let it dry once again. You can see in my camera, just because of the way the lighting is, we're getting a little buckling in our paper. That's what happens when you work wet on wet, even on 100% cotton paper, unless you kind of pre-stretch it and all of that, which I ain't got time for pre-stretching for sure. But, you know, it's very manageable, and as it dries, it will flatten out. This would be much more severe if you were working on cellulose paper. So if you are working on cellulose paper, just be careful and go slow. All right, so now let's get back into our grass. I am going to use my sap green color again, but this time I'm adding ultramarine. You could also add an indigo, you could add a cobalt, but you want a blue hue to this. You want it to be more blue-green and very dark. So very saturated. Let me see if you can pull my palette out here. You can see how saturated that is. Maybe if I pull my palette on the side. You don't want to see the rest of my studio right now. Let's pull the palette on the side so you can kind of see those colors a little more clearly. So I know I'm going to have a tree in this area here, casting a shadow. So I'm going to make it darker in that area, but I'm also going to add just different textures and shadows throughout. So my tree I'm going to put up here, and it's going to be mostly kind of, it's going to go from here up. So I'm just going to put a little bit darker area underneath. So I'm just pulling some water. So I'm using variations of pure color from the palette and then also adding some water. And again, just creating shadows and highlights, which are going to create like the illusion of kind of dips and valleys. I'm going to leave this light kind of behind where the tree is going to be. So we really get the contrast to that shadow to the ground. Not under the tree, will not be in shadow. And I'm really letting the texture do a lot of work for me, letting my dry brush kind of, or my brush run out of paint and create these textured areas. And now I'm also going to take some almost pure ultramarine and start to add some vertical strokes. Just with the very tip of my brush. I like to concentrate down in the bottom here in the corner, kind of closest to where the viewer is. These little grasses popping up right in the bottom. And you can change your brush if you want. If you need a smaller brush to achieve this, this brush is really great for kind of fine lines at this larger size. To a point, you know, there's certain things I am going to switch my brush for, but I can get a pretty nice point on here. And then I'm even going to start some vertical lines in other areas. Just using the side of my brush. Maybe create a little bush back here. Doesn't have to be so specific. Just a little hump of color can translate as a bush in this nice loose like landscape. All right, I know I'm gonna have a tree over here on this side, and I'm just gonna, I know my my sky is still a little wet, but I'm gonna start dabbing it in and just let that first layer kind of blend out a little bit. So nice and soft. I'm just using the same dark color that I use for the darker areas. I'll add another layer to add some shadow and dimension to that. But I'll put that over there in the corner. And then I know I'm gonna have a few little tree-like shapes here, kind of in the distance. And again, I'm not exactly translating this. Now I'm just kind of adding what I want, where I want, but overall in the general mood, it kind of all goes together. Okay, so we're gonna let that dry. This sky needs to dry a little bit more before we start putting in our trees. So let that dry, and we're gonna put in our tree and our tree line in the distance. All right, we're back and we're dry enough that we can put in our tree here. It's not going to bleed on us when we put new paint on top of this sky area. What I will say is there's a lot of different ways to paint different trees. We're going to be doing a leafy tree or a deciduous tree. And it's going to be kind of rounded, and almost triangular shape in nature when you look at the whole thing. Pointier at top, wider at the base. I do have a video I'll put right here where you can follow along with some different types of tree painting that give you a little more insight into how to put together a tree. But we're just going to get started and go for it right here. So I'm not going to put in the trunk yet. I'm actually just going to start at the top. And I'm using my same, you know, this darker green color, but I've added a little water to it. And I'm just going to start to stipple in with the top of my brush. And I'm kind of being wiggly and wobbly. Those are very technical terms, to create this shape. I'm letting sky poke through. I want to leave some white space. Okay. And this is going to be layer one. We're going to do a couple of different layers on this with different colors to create shadow and dimension. And then I'm widening towards the base. And again, you can see my brush. My hand is moving this way, this way. My brush is moving all about. I'm not just stamping in. You know, a lot of people have trouble. They just keep their brush in one direction. I'm pushing it down so it makes a funky shape a little bit. I think someone said scumble across the page. That might be a Paul Clark term. He has excellent tutorials as well. All right, so that's my first layer. Now I'm going to mix up a little bit more sap green. I'm not going to worry too much about this drying in between. If some of it's going to dry a little bit, and that's fine, but I want some of it to still be wet. And I'm going to add in this deeper color. So that was sap green and ultramarine. And now trees are going to be inherently darker towards the base or the bottom because it's underneath the top of all the rest of these branches that are coming out from it. And those branches are going to cast shadows on the part below. I'm going to put a little, like, kind of break the shape a little bit. I don't want my tree to be too perfect. Trees really aren't perfect. Okay. And now I'm going to pick up some straight ultramarine and a little Payne's gray and put even darker color right towards the bottom. And I'll pick out a few branches a little higher up or areas where I'll add a little bit of this dark color just to add some dimension. We're going to, you know, this is a pretty flat painting in terms of there's no major light source anywhere. It's, you know, the light is very diffused by the clouds. So there's no like shining bright light that we have to worry about communicating on the tree. I'm gonna lighten up. And then you can even throw in with some of that darker color, throw in a few splatters. Be really careful just to create some more interesting shapes. If you're worried about going too far around your tree, go ahead and cover that up with paper towel or something to protect that area. My printer is randomly going off. Someone must be printing in the house. I don't know if you can hear that. All right, and now I'm gonna leave that to let that dry. Once it's dry, if I feel like it needs another layer of darker colors or more green or even a little yellow in there, here I could throw a little yellow in just to add a little pop of brighter color. But you can go back through and add more layers to your trees for sure. They don't always have to be done on the first try. All right, and now I'm gonna take a little burnt umber. Is this burnt umber? I don't even know. Yes, a little burnt umber from my palette. This is a dark brown color. I'm gonna add a little Payne's gray to it to darken it a little bit more. And then for my trunk, it's gonna be a pretty thin trunk. Your trunks do not have to be as wide as you think they do. Just gonna bring it down to the ground here. I'm gonna add just a little suggestion of another branch kind of coming up. And then what you can do after that is done, we're going to go up into some of these white spaces with a liner brush and add some little branches in between. All right, and now I'm just going to take my brush towards the base of this and just blend, look, my words are getting caught, blend this bottom out a little bit. And then I'm going to add a little more green towards the bottom here too, because in the shadow, I don't want it to be like a perfect little brown patch underneath. That's a little too cartoonish. There you go. And you can add more to your shadow along the bottom. And that is our tree. All right, let's let this dry and we'll add our finishing details. All right, let's finish up our final details. Now, all I'm going to do, this dried really nicely. I like the color, I like the shadows. I'm going to add in our tree line in the background to add a little bit more perspective and depth. And then I'm also going to add my tiny little branches throughout my tree. Now you could use a liner brush if you have a liner brush. I'm just going to use a smaller round brush. Let me see here. I'm just going to use a number 4 round brush. This is a Princeton Select. These are the brushes I use to teach my in-person classes. I'm going to make a nice dark green color with Payne's gray and sap green and maybe a little ultramarine blue. So nice and dark. Now this tree line is way in the distance and I'm just going to go along my horizon line, and you can even kind of paint in and then just give it some height, varied heights, and you know, it can be low in some spots and then have some bigger jumps. And these trees are super far away. So, You're not going to see much detail. You're just going to get the idea that way back there is a line of trees. And you can even skip some spots, like keep it really low, just put a line there. If there's a break in the trees, go right between these guys here. And I'll stop right here at this tree. So this tree, I was pretty happy with how it turned out just on that first layer. It's a little fuzzy. You could go back in with some of your, and let's do that right now. I'm going to just take some of my dark sap green color and just add some additional detail on top, just to give this some depth, some shadows, some texture. Boop, 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 boop. You know, you're not going to see the trunk of this. You're just seeing it kind of stick out. It's going to be like a pine tree, a bushy pine. Just a few spots of darker color. There we go. And last but not least, those tiny little branches kind of within our tree. Now you're just imagine the tree. You don't want your branches to go any like really funky directions that they wouldn't actually go. So you just want to imagine what underneath that tree looks like, and imagine, okay, a line from here and a branch would go this way. It wouldn't go this way on this side necessarily. And you don't have to put in a ton, just a few. Just a few. There we go. And I'm just going to drop in a little more blue right along the bottom here. So I just went for some straight ultramarine. To create even a little more shadow and a little more contrast. And there you have it. We have our nice shadow underneath our tree and our line along the back. Last but not least, you can see I like to fiddle. I'm going to add a little more detail to these little trees here that we put in. Just stippling with the tip of my brush. Pointer at the top, less so at the bottom. Kind of fades out into these grasses and brushes here. So you can go in with a liner brush, you can go in with your tiny brush, add a few more. I'm really happy with these front ones, but just to show you in a dark color, a few more really in focus, crisp and clear grasses in the front. There we go. And there we have it. We are done with our little English landscape from the area between Windermere and Bowness-on-Windermere. I'm going to peel my tape off even though it's not completely dry yet, just to show you what that looks like with that nice crisp border. So if you enjoy watching this channel, I would really appreciate if you would subscribe, like, comment on this video. It really helps me be seen by other people. It helps keep me motivated to keep creating video content for you. And I would really, really appreciate it. So thank you so much. I'm Shayna Cersei, and I will be seeing you soon for our next painting video, where we'll be tackling some more scenes from my trip to the UK. Also keep an eye out for some bonus videos on some other topics, as well as back to basics. I'll be releasing some basics videos where we're concentrating specifically on some of those skills you learn at the very beginning. If you haven't learned them yet, it will help improve your skills when you're starting to do full paintings, as well as serve as a great refresher for a lot of us, getting back to basics and remembering some of our skills and drills and techniques from the very beginning. All right, take care, everybody. Happy painting.